Sumeru's tale is finally over, and it's time to go to the snazzy, jazzy, and questionably corrupt and polluted nation of justice, Fontaine. As a personal bias, I am absolutely in love with Fontaine's aesthetics, from its promise of technology almost akin to modern-day transportation to their clothing styles, and today I want to open this video with the question of what will happen in Chapter 4, The Masquerade of the Guilty. Today, I'll be giving my mini theories compiled after a lot of Fontaine videos updated after so long. Disclaimer: this video stems from a lot of mini theories supporting other mini theories, which means that nothing here is indicative of the final product. I'm also not going to completely talk about the culture or connections of Fontaine with real-life friends, since I've already done that before. I also won't be covering leaks because I personally don't want to read through featured content leaks. Anyway, let's begin with a brief run-through of everything we know so far about Fontaine that could potentially be our lens into the Archon quest. The Masquerade of the Guilty is the name of Chapter 4, with the twins Lynette and Lene being the stars of the show. The god of justice lives for the spectacle of the courtroom, seeking to judge all other gods, but even she knows not to make an enemy of the divine. Fontaine is the land of glamour, oftentimes referred to by its people as a beautiful and progressive nation with technology that far surpasses the others except maybe Snezhnaya. With what little we have known, we have seen them develop clockworks, cameras, films, furnaces, and even transportation. But in terms of ideology, Fontainians hold their nation's identity as tinkerers and creators to a massive regard. They have an almost awestruck expression when regarding their country. So let's use those core ideas to theorize on some possible story concepts. The first one is the dangers of human technology. If there's one moral dilemma that I think well encompasses Fontaine as a nation, it's the dilemma of technological advancement surpassing human morality and safety. As a nation, Fontaine is filled with technological innovations, even to the point that they have their own research institute of kinetic engineering, an institute dedicated to studying machineries and energy. Unlike Sumeru and its academia, information warfare isn't completely the name of the game, but there are several interesting points in Fontaine's technology and their mindset. One is the actual creation of the products themselves. On one hand, Fontainians truly do aim to create and enhance their mundane lifestyles with the help of gizmos and tech, exemplified by the following. Fontaine has been able to create cameras and films, as well as elemental-based transportation according to the stories of the NPCs. For example, toys and knickknacks are created, and clockwork appears to be an established creation in Fontainian society. The Mikage furnace was facilitated and managed by Fontainian jurisdiction at a time before their consultants returned to Fontaine. They've also been delving into alternative energy research, which would definitely be several steps above most nations. But on the other hand, Fontainian technology can almost border on dangerous territory. There is a strange lack of self-regulation when it comes to the mentality of tinkerers in Fontaine, and we actually see this in several cases. For example, Fontaine is currently polluted to a point of being barely habitable, a byproduct of neglect of the after effects and waste produced by creating technology. We know that the Tatarasuna incident was caused by Totore and his meandering with the crystal marrow from inside, but the creation of the Mikage furnace and the politics behind that are still present to this day. According to Miyuki from Tatara Tales, it was only a few years ago from present time that the Tenryo Commission felt that they would have the ability to forge weapons for the purposes of flaunting, so they hired a team of consultants from Fontaine to build the Mikage furnace, a machine that can fully harvest the powers of the Tataragami. However, most consultants left before the production was even complete. So I'd just like to clarify, by the way, that Mikage furnace incident is separate from Dotore's incident. Xavier better not be 400 years old, or so help me God. Another example is the Fontaine Institute also experienced a massive explosion during a particularly catastrophic experimental failure. Fontaine's energy system is also very special, as mentioned by the NPC known as Bertrand, but it's not sustainable. He proposes alternative energy solutions because if Fontaine's machineries lose their power sources, society would essentially collapse. But why should we talk about the relationship of Fontaine's citizens to technology? Well, this is important because in Genshin, unbridled creation can lead to advancement and technology, but also to hubris and ego. If you read the stories of the Fontaine NPCs, especially the innovators, they're definitely not villains or bad people. They're just ambitious creators. but their enthusiasm to create these wacky items should be scrutinized with a grain of salt. The problem with Fontaine's regulations is that they have all these laws and paperwork to facilitate their machine production without actually doing anything about the problem when things go sour. And unfortunately, this also bleeds into how people are quite lax with the repercussions. The Mikage Furnace Emergency Response Procedure, for example, was 893 pages long, but Xavier says that the trial version has some information of the emergency measures applicable in a wartime scenario, and apparently when it explodes, because again, the consultant team went back to Fontaine. It's an emergency response book that hardly has any information about containment, and again, it's 893 pages! Another one was when the Fontaine Research Institute exploded, it didn't take the quote-unquote strange and redundant processes and the overly complicated management systems along with it, and suddenly it just came back strangely new and more polished. So to cut this point off, the complexity of Fontaine's machine regulations don't actually translate well to real practical safety management, which actually mirrors well with the next story beat that I want to talk about. The Masquerade of the Guilty. All glitter, no gold. The first concept that I want to theorize as a main story for the Archon quest is the concept of flamboyance as a facade. Bertrand's dialogue actually exemplifies this best. For some people, Fontaine is a most convenient place to live in, but for others, it is not but a place of grief and disappointment. And it's important to see the dichotomy between how Fontaine NPCs see their nation. On one hand, Fontainians regard true beauty and elegance. They consider themselves as the hub of all arts and creatives, constantly holding music festivals and appreciating literature from all across the flat world. However, on the other hand, Libin says that Fontaine's been feeling oppressive and dangerous lately, and that the locals are becoming pretty angsty. Not to mention, Patrice says that Fontainians, especially researchers, almost have a legal and social responsibility when it comes to their studies. If you spend money but not produce any results, that could land you several dozen charges, including, but not limited to, wasting public funds and misappropriating academic resources. But you know what's fascinating? Patrice was willing to defend the homeland, but instead blamed the quote-unquote additional factors, which is a really fascinating mindset that seems so ingrained in Fontainian society. There is a level of complacency within the citizens, where because they have benefited from these systems in the past, they could still enjoy the manner of conveniences, almost to the point of disregarding the actual bad parts of the system. This is in direct contrast to something like the Inazuma Sakoku Decree, where the attitude of the Inazumans were mostly defiant in the face of an unjust system. Though I do want to preface that a sudden decree would definitely have stronger emotions to it, there's almost an air of apologetic complacency within NPC dialogues from Fontaine. But to continue that topic of flamboyance as a facade, I want to open 3 important pillars of Fontaine's Archon quest: the government, the Archon, and the Fatui. Let's speculate into Fontaine's state of political affairs. Yanfei, a legal expert from Liyue, even said that Fontaine's laws are very complicated, and this mirrors well with the whole machine regulation business from a while ago. For background, Fontaine currently operates on a judicial system, where the Court of Fontaine and the Chief Justice manage most court proceedings regarding all legal matters. The Court of Fontaine is made up allegedly of beautiful maidens, ethereal as the clouds themselves, who serve as the main authoritative figure in the nation. Nahida says that a Hydro Archon Fossilor won't preside over individual trials, but instead, she just stays there because she likes to immerse herself in that sort of atmosphere, a nod back to Dane's hint that she lives for the spectacle of the courtroom. This provides us with a very theatrical lens in the court instead of an actual proper system, so it's possible that Fontaine's court system and how they actually manage their laws could be summed up into 3 words: overbloated, complicated, and performative. It's not to say that the court is inherently corrupted, but there's something strange about the detached vibe the court has with the rest of the people, not to mention that they're regarded as being ethereal. It almost reminds me of sirens in a way, beautiful maidens that are hiding something much scarier underneath the surface. Doesn't help that Fontaine is a nation about water and the sea, some place that has a lot of secrets. But that's neither here nor there, because now let's move on to the Archon. When I talk about the Archon Focalor, there's this air of almost overcompensation, and here's why. Focalor from the Ars Goetia is depicted as a man with griffin wings, kills men, drowns them, and overthrows warships. But if commanded by a conjurer, he will not harm any man or thing. Focalor has the power over wind and sea, and had hoped to return to heaven after 1,000 years, but he was deceived in his hope. I want to emphasize on this last quote, the thought of returning to original power or becoming greater than one's current self. Focalor in Genshin Impact seems to be a very superficial character on the surface, with herself enjoying the atmosphere of the courtroom rather than actually being there to facilitate the adjudication of the trial. Had she not been the Archon, I don't think she'd even bother to give a verdict. When you read the Varunada Lazarite gemstone, much like the other gemstones that have small anecdotes from the other Archons, she states that her ideals have no stains, and that the people here bear no sins in the eyes of the gods. But the other side to that gemstone are the lines saying, "Only laws in the tribunal can judge someone. They can judge even me. So praise my magnificence and beauty." There's a tonal contrast happening here. On one hand, Focalor takes great pride in the state of the nation, but almost to the point that she needs to actively paint the picture that no one in Fontaine is doing anything wrong. In the eyes of the gods and whatever laws they've put out for the land, she is confident that Fontaine is firm, and I have my reason to believe that she's comparing Fontaine's progress to Conria's judgment, in which both nations had an air of strong nationalism and pride in their creations and advancement. Yet one nation fell to hubris. It's only natural that she, as an Archon of a nation that's going through innovation, becomes afraid of crossing the line of the divine. Her judging all other gods could even be her thinking that the Archons have a poor way of managing their own nations, believing that Fontaine's industrial revolution is a clear-cut sign that they're living in the future. And again, it's almost like she's overcompensating for something. Because on the other hand, she regards Celestia with higher authorities and acknowledges that she's not impervious to judgment. That's why she's saying she's keeping in line, and that she's pure. I'll be honest with you, while I was reading this entire passage, it did feel like she was being a pick-me Archon. Anyway, moving on. But the question is, what could she even be hiding to have this kind of attitude? Well, there's this very old theory that I've actually covered about the God of Justice hiding a criminal act herself, and that's the death of the previous Archon of Fontaine. If you didn't already know, Focalor isn't one of the original 7 Archons that won the war. Instead, she assumed control of Fontaine after the death and disappearance of the old Hydro Archon, as some of the Lock folk, like the Oceanid, refused to recognize Focalor as their Archon and went on self-imposed exile. Now, the theory goes that Focalor actually killed the original Hydro Archon, and at least was meant to replace them in some way. And this is because of the Oceanid asking the Traveler if they're an assassin from her homeland, hinting that maybe the current Fontaine system doesn't have the best relationship with those from the previous era. To continue, the murder could have been either a mercy kill or an act of usurpation. Mercy kill would work if Fontaine's original Archon was somehow compromised, like a corruption in the Cataclysm, or even just killed like how A became the new Archon after Makoto's passing. But I'm leaning more towards Deicide. One, because Deicide is absolutely cool on paper, but also because of Focalor's attitude and statements in the present time. Her insistence that she's pure, and the absolute abhorrence of the Lockfolk for the current Fontaine. This theory also uses the original Focalor from the Ars Goetia, where there was a promise of regaining old power but was lied to. What if Focalor was a god who lost the Archon War but had to serve under the original Hydro Archon, and then she had to kill them for some reason? Maybe she believed that she could create a safer and better Fontaine, or maybe something about the Cataclysm scared her, or maybe something about fate was pulling the strings, or maybe Focalors just believed that the old Archon wasn't safe for Fontaine. There's actually a lot of possibilities for this theory. But again, we're just banging rocks together and seeing what sticks. There's really no way for us to confirm or deny anything. We have like 3 sentences worth of lore about Focalor. Honestly, the reason I want her to be someone guilty of a crime is because of the sheer irony of all of it. We haven't had willful deicide actually covered in the Archons, and to have the God of Justice be the one to represent that would be such a fascinating irony to her character. But the next one is the last pillar of all the Archon quests. Where do the Fatui fall? If I'm talking about the role of the Fatui, I should separate this into two questions. Who are the Harbingers involved, and how will they be involved? Starting with the first one, I believe that Sandrone would be a prominent character for this Archon quest. Her themes of being a somewhat enthusiastic and obsessive thinker would bode very well with the core ideas of Fontaine and technology. The isolation of creation to the point of almost antagonizing everyone around you is such a fascinating mindset for the antagonist of a nation going through an industrial revolution. And I think her secondary supporting Harbinger would be El Dottore, just for the sole reason that Harbingers tend to bleed to the next nation if you notice the pattern, with Tartaglia being the special case of bleeding through an event, not an Archon quest. But besides that, there's really nothing that I can say. I don't think Columbina and Piera would be good boss fights because of the misplacement of motifs. If the Columbina is a silly theory, then I think releasing her too early would be a bit of an injustice to her build-up. Arlecchino is actually a pretty close second to a potential Harbinger boss fight for Fontaine. But the next question is, how would they be involved? Well, from a Fontaine perspective, I think they'd be involved with incentivizing the nation with better and brighter technology. I would even wager that the Fatui's biggest bargaining chip is the introduction of a new energy source to power Fontaine. Honestly, the best way for the Fatui to control Fontaine is to have control of the power sources. You can't exactly have a nation that's based on technology suddenly just not have any ways of powering it. But from an Archon perspective, I think that the Fatui and the Archon herself are collaborating together. But to wrap this all off in a nice, neat bow, let's talk about 500 years ago. Fontaine in the Cataclysm. I feel like if Fontaine had to have taken anything from the Cataclysm, it's the need for social and industrial change. Teyvat was horribly broken down after the Cataclysm, but one unfortunate thing that the other Archon quests haven't been able to fully flesh out and explain is societal change. I think that Fontaine's unique position of being the closest to our modern-day technology and problems would allow us to see through the lens of how much can a nation's lifestyle change after a devastating event. It's unknown when the Industrial Revolution of Fontaine began, but I theorize that Fontaine's currently technology-based mindset and the sudden curiosity and need for research into stronger, more developed lifestyles came from the horrors of Conria and the Cataclysm. Maybe it wasn't immediate, but the seeds could have been planted that far back. And maybe, as a celestial entity, Fossilors believe that Fontaine needs to adapt, but also understand that she can't adapt too fast, or else she'll suffer the same fate that Conria did. But that's it for me today. Overall, if I were to give a brief structure of the Archon quest, I think we're going to go to the classic French Revolution thing, with Lynette and Lene being important fronts of the charge. But here's the problem with that storyline. If they're not careful enough, this could have the same story beats as Inazuma, a revolution against a god who became too obsessed with their ideals, not to mention a corrupt legal system. Which is why it'll be so much better if they reinvent the wheel and have another structure of the story. But I have trust in Hoyoverse. I think their plans for Fontaine are much grander than what theorists would have you believe. And that's it for me today. My name is Aster, and before I end this video, can I just say these past few weeks have not been the best? If you haven't noticed, I actually went dead silent last week, and I think it has something to do with motivation. But I'm trying to repace myself slowly but surely. I don't know. Guess I'll be seeing you folks around. Maybe. Bye-bye! Remember to take your water and drink your stuff. I don't know. Anyway, my name is Aster, and thank you for chilling with me. This was the Paris of my childhood. These were the borders of my life. In this crumbling, dusty attic, where an artist loved his wife. Easy to remember, harder to move on, knowing the Paris of my childhood is gone. Well, that's 33 minutes.